Hi, my name is Bais, and although I'm now 34 years old, I still clearly remember what shaped me into who I am. My life hasn't been as simple as it might seem from the outside. I work as a public relations specialist for a large industrial company. I have a decent salary. 3 years ago, I was able to afford to buy an apartment with a mortgage. And last year, after my grandmother died, I inherited another apartment. But to be honest, the path to this was long and sometimes very difficult, and that's probably why I'm now telling you how it all began. My story goes back to my distant childhood, when I was just 10 years old and the world suddenly collapsed in an instant. My father died of a heart attack, and it happened so suddenly that for a long time I couldn't believe it. The day before, he had held my hand while he taught me to ride a bike, supporting and encouraging me. The next day, he was gone, and our house was filled with a silence that was more oppressive than words. My mother walked like a shadow, her eyes empty, and even though I was still a child, I felt like I had lost not only my father, but also a part of myself. He was my whole world, a source of joy and warmth, the person with whom I felt safe. A year later, my mother, exhausted by loneliness, married a man named Gaspar, and I sincerely hoped that life would be filled with color again. My mother smiled more and more often, seemed to come alive around him, and at first he seemed quite friendly, speaking to me softly, inquiring about my school affairs, and it seemed to me that perhaps a new, happier chapter lay ahead for us. But everything changed dramatically when I turned 12, and my half-sister, Elma, joined our family. From that moment on, I seemed invisible. My mother never left the baby's side. Every day was now dedicated solely to her daughter, and Gaspar openly demonstrated that his sole concern was his own child. "Bais, watch Elma while I take a shower," my mother would say every day with such a familiar intonation that I no longer even hoped to hear her address me differently. "Girl, I need you to wash the dishes," Gaspar would say, not looking up from his newspaper as if I were not his wife's daughter, but a servant. "Girl, Elma needs her bottle." My mother's voice would drift from the other room, and these words became an almost daily background noise for me. I was only 13, but I already had a job on my shoulders that few adults could handle. I cleaned, cooked, and looked after the baby. My grades were plummeting from exhaustion, and I could only dream of making friends, since after school I had to rush home to replace my mother and stepfather, for whom I became an unpaid nanny. And then one day, when everything in the house was going on as usual, exhaustingly, my grandmother, Conchetta, my father's mother, arrived, and her keen, attentive gaze immediately captured everything hidden behind our family's facade. She was not a soft woman. On the contrary, her words always cut to the quick, without beating around the bush, and that's why I knew she wouldn't remain silent for long. She watched for only about an hour as my mother and Gaspar ordered me around as if I were part of the furniture, then took my mother firmly by the elbow and led her into the kitchen. I fell silent in the living room, but my ears were alert, and I heard every word. "Patricia, this girl is unhappy," my grandmother said, not trying to soften her words. "Conchetta, it's hard for me to be alone with a child. I need Bais's help," my mother defended herself, but her voice was muffled, defensive, as if she herself understood the weakness of her arguments. "She's not your maid, she's your daughter. Look at her. Remember the last time you saw her smile?" Grandma persisted, and I held my breath, waiting for an answer. A long pause. Then Mom's voice. "I don't know what you want. I can't be in 2 places at once." "Let her live with you." At that moment, Gaspar intervened, his tone almost relieved. Actually, it might be the best solution. And that hit me harder than anything else, because it became clear that my stepfather wasn't just okay with it. He was happy to be rid of me. When Mom returned to the living room, I was sitting on the sofa with Elma in my arms, and looking at me, she uttered the words that would change my fate forever. "My dear girl, wouldn't you like to stay with Grandma Conchetta for a while?" I didn't hesitate for a second. Yes, absolutely yes. Gaspar even allowed himself to smile, and Mom nodded, as if she had known in advance that this would happen. That same day, I packed my simple belongings, a few books, a few clothes, and left behind a room that had never truly felt like home. Ahead lay life with my grandmother, and it was like entering a completely different world. Her apartment filled from floor to ceiling with books, the smells of delicious food she cooked every evening, conversations around the table about everything from school and movies to life itself. On the very first day, my grandmother said, "You don't have to clean my house, Bais. That's my concern. Your job is to be a child and study." And I couldn't believe it was true, because no one had ever said such words to me before. With her, for the first time, I felt valued and welcomed, and no one demanded diapers and bottles from me. No one considered me a nuisance. But 4 months later, my grandmother invited me for a serious talk, sat me down across from her, and looking me straight in the eye said, "I've officially adopted you, my dear. Your mother has given up her parental rights." I stared at her, not believing my ears, and everything inside me was a jumble of confusion, bewilderment, and a vague fear, because I didn't fully understand what exactly her statement meant. It was only when my grandmother calmly said, "This means that you are now legally my daughter, and this house is yours as much as you want it to be," that I felt a chill run down my spine. Part of me felt crushed that my own mother could so easily discard me, as if I were an unwanted possession, but another part felt a quiet relief, because for the first time in a long time, I knew that there was someone nearby who wanted to see me, who was glad of my presence, and now I was safe. From that moment on, my life changed almost magically. My grades began to soar, I made friends at school, and I devoured books from my grandmother's endless collection, one after another. For the first time since my father's death, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I had a home where I was accepted for who I was. I rarely saw my mother Gaspar and little Elma, mostly on holidays or birthdays, and every time I saw a hint of relief in their eyes as I said goodbye and left, even though they were outwardly quite polite. Meanwhile, my mother posted dozens of photos of Elma on her online page, her first steps, birthdays, school performances, and I never saw even a tiny snapshot of myself there. And at some point, I simply stopped going there, because what's the point of looking for yourself in a place where you've never been? I graduated with honors, went to college on a scholarship, and got a degree in communications, and my grandmother was incredibly proud. She came to my graduation and cried when they called my name. After college, I found a job, the same one I still have today, and was able to move into my own place. Just when I was already on my feet, my mother suddenly decided to reconnect with us, and one day, completely out of the blue, she called and said, "Bye, honey. I think we should start over, put the past behind us." And my curiosity was piqued, strong enough to give it a try. We started seeing each other for holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Elma's birthday, and I always arrived bearing expensive gifts for my sister, who by then had grown up and entered her teens. I could clearly see that Mom and Gaspar accepted this almost with relief, as if that was precisely the role, the generous older sister, they had assigned me in the family picture. Elma didn't seem particularly grateful, but I excused her. A child is a child, and I thought that with time she would warm up to me. This went on for years, and I thought our relationship was quite decent, not intimate, but at least civilized. And then last year my grandmother passed away, and although she was 89 and had lived a long, rich life, her passing broke my heart, because she was the only real parent I knew. When her will was read, I learned that she'd left me an apartment and $150,000, and I also discovered something I'd never even suspected. The house where Mom and Gaspar lived had belonged to my grandmother the whole time. She'd owned it for decades, and after Dad's death, out of kindness, let Mom stay there. I didn't know what to do with this information and decided to leave it at that for now, since Mom had never mentioned it, and neither had I. Soon, Mom asked if Elma could live in Grandma's apartment while she went to college, and I agreed, even though it meant losing my rent income, because I thought it was the right thing to do, because family was more important. For a while, It seemed like everything was going well, as if we had finally become one of those happy families I'd only seen from the outside. But one day at work, while I was reviewing yet another press release about a new product launch, my phone rang, and Mom's name appeared on the screen. For a second, I considered ignoring the call, as we usually only talked about holidays, but something inside me made me answer. "Hi, Mom, what's wrong?" I asked, trying to guess what had prompted her unexpected call. "Bais, dear, I'm calling about Elma's graduation gift," she said, and I leaned back in my chair, remembering the recent ceremony we'd all attended, how I'd applauded when Elma's name was announced, how I'd seen Mom and Gaspar's eyes sparkle with pride, and how truly delighted I was to see the whole family happy together. "Yes, I've been thinking about that," I replied. "I was planning on sending her to Mexico for a week, to celebrate before she starts looking for a job." There was a pause on the other end, and there was something unsettling in the silence. And when Mom finally spoke, her words struck like a blow. "Well, that's nice, of course, but I think she needs something more substantial." "More substantial?" I frowned. "Mom, a week in Mexico costs a pretty penny. It's a wonderful gift." "Bais," her voice softened but insistent. "You know Elma has been living in your grandmother's apartment for a year now, and she's grown accustomed to her own space. A young woman needs a place where she can live and build her own life." I knew where this was all heading, and I absolutely didn't like it, because behind my mother's polite words, I heard a familiar tone, a request disguised as a demand wrapped in the pretty paper of concern for her youngest daughter. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "Elma already lives in an apartment. Do you realize how much money students pay for housing? She's received a huge privilege, and now that she's graduated, it's time for her to learn to cope on her own." Before I could finish, Mom interrupted me abruptly, her tone taking me back to my childhood. "I never said she had to move out, but I thought you understood. She should keep the apartment. It's the right thing to do." "No, Mom," I replied, already feeling anger boiling inside me. "I'm not going to give her the apartment if that's what you're getting at." Her voice took on that sharp edge I knew all too well. "Bais, she's your sister. The family helps the family. You've been so generous all these years, paying for her college, and now you can really help her." I took a deep breath to keep from losing my temper and said, "Paying for her tuition and giving her gifts on holidays is one thing, but losing your property to someone else's whims is quite another." "And how is that different?" Mom persisted. "You have your own apartment. You don't need two." I clenched my fists to keep my composure. "Mom, I don't have to explain my financial decisions to you. The trip to Mexico is a generous gift, and Elma should be grateful." The word grateful clearly stung. "Grateful?" Mom raised her voice. "After everything we've been through as a family, after we've worked so hard to repair our relationship, this is how you're going to repay us?" I pressed my lips together, trying to contain my resentment. "Repay us?" "Mom, I've been more than generous to Elma. I helped pay for her 4 years of school. I let her live in an apartment that could bring me money. What more do you want from me?" In response, I heard a cold, "I want you to do the right thing. I want you to help your sister get a start in life." "But I'm already helping," I said firmly. "Free housing is help." There was a moment of silence, and I even thought she'd finally heard me, but then her stubborn voice rang out. "Think about it, Bais. Really think about what's right before your eyes." I closed my eyes to collect my thoughts and said, "I've thought about it. A trip to Mexico is my last offer." My mother hung up without even saying goodbye. I sat with the phone in my hands and felt that same old knot tying itself inside, familiar from childhood. The feeling that no matter how hard I tried, it would never be enough for them, never be enough. I shook off the thoughts and forced myself to return to work, hoping that this would be the end of it. 2 weeks passed, and there were no calls or messages from my family. I thought maybe Mom had accepted my decision and we'd avoided an open conflict, that Elma would go to Mexico, relax, and life would go on as usual. But then one day, My phone vibrated, and a notification popped up. Mom had posted something on social media, and the strangest thing was, she'd tagged my name. This was unusual because she almost never mentioned me in public posts. I opened the notification and felt a chill run through my body. There was a photo from last Christmas, the four of us standing by the tree, Mom, Gaspar, Elma, and I, all smiling like a happy family. But the caption underneath the photo made my hands shake. Bais promised to give her little sister an apartment in honor of her college graduation. I thank God for such a kind and generous eldest daughter. I reread the signature 3 times, hoping I'd made a mistake, that I'd misunderstood. But every word was clear. Every word struck me in the heart. The comments were already pouring in. What a wonderful big sister. Elma is so lucky. This is what real family means. You're an angel. I felt physically ill. Mom had done this on purpose, exposed me to public scrutiny, trapped me in a trap from which there was no escape without loss. How could I now write that it wasn't true? I'd look like either a liar or a cruel, selfish woman who broke her promises. With trembling hands, I dialed her number, and she answered immediately, as if she'd been expecting my call. "Hi, Bais," she said, almost cheerfully. "What the hell did you just do?" I tried to speak quietly as I was still sitting in the office, but inside, rage was seething. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied in a feigned innocence. "The Facebook post." "You told everyone I was giving the apartment to Elma," I hissed. "Well, isn't that true?" Her tone was almost carefree. "No." I made it clear that wasn't happening. I only suggested a trip to Mexico. That's my final word. I could barely contain myself. "I thought you'd change your mind once you had time to think it over," she replied so calmly, as if it were a trivial matter, even though she'd just lied to the world. "Are you crazy?" I hissed. "Lying to everyone just to force me?" Her voice changed instantly. The lightness vanished, and a cold, hard, calculating tone came over the phone. "I wrote that so you wouldn't have a choice. Elma's graduation is this Saturday at Romano's. There will be about 50 people, family, friends, classmates. You must come with the deed to the apartment and the transfer documents, all signed and ready." I couldn't believe my ears when she said this in a cold, almost triumphant tone, as if it were some trivial condition, not my life, my job, my reputation. "And if I don't do it?" I breathed out. And my mother, without a moment's hesitation, added calmly and firmly, "Then I'll make sure everyone knows you're a liar. I'll tell them you promised Elma an apartment and then broke your word. You work in public relations, Bais, and how will it look when rumors spread that you can't be trusted and don't keep your promises? Do you think your company will want to keep an employee with such a reputation?" These words hit me like ice rain in the face, and I was literally speechless, realizing that my own mother had just threatened to ruin not just my relationship with my sister, but also my career, which I had spent years building. "You have until Saturday, Bais." Her voice was a final verdict. "Bring the documents or deal with the consequences yourself." Another short beep, and she hung up, as if it were an ordinary conversation, not worth a single second of sympathy. I sat motionless, staring at the phone screen, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst out. I couldn't believe she'd actually done this, that she'd set a trap and was now trying to draw me in, to force me to play by her rules. Gathering my strength, I immediately dialed Elma's number. I still hoped that maybe she didn't know about Mom's plan, that this was all a misunderstanding, and that she could be convinced. "Hi, Bais," came my sister's voice, even and calm as if nothing had happened. "Elma, did you see what Mom wrote on Facebook?" I asked, trying to sound softer than I felt. "Yes, I did," came her dry reply. "Did you know she was going to do that?" I held my breath, waiting for her answer. There was a brief pause, and then I heard, "Yes, we talked about that." At that moment, my heart sank painfully, as if a coldness had spread through my chest. "And you're okay with her lying and basically blackmailing me?" I asked, no longer able to contain my indignation. Elma suddenly laughed. genuinely, sincerely, as if my question were absurd. Blackmail? Come on, Bais. You have 2 apartments and I have none. Is that fair? I nearly choked with indignation. I earned my apartment, I worked for it, I invested my time and money, and you've been living in your grandmother's apartment for a year now, paying nothing for it. Yes, and I'm grateful for this handout, she replied calmly. But now I want something permanent, something that's truly mine. A handout? I repeated, stunned by her words. I paid for your college education, and you call that a handout? I've been helping you all these years. And I'm grateful for the charity, but that's a different matter, Bais. It's about my future. And without giving me a chance to respond, she simply hung up. That night, I sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling, feeling my familiar world crumble completely. The 3 people I'd called my family my whole life had just appeared before me as complete strangers, unfamiliar and cold. People who believed they could manipulate me, pressure me, and intimidate me into voluntarily giving up hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property. And suddenly, despite all the pain and disappointment, a laugh escaped me. Quiet, bitter, but still a laugh. They thought they were so clever that they'd caught me in their cunning trap, and I knew they had no idea they'd just started a game they knew I could play too. The next morning, I went into my home office and pulled out an old box of documents I'd received right after my grandmother's funeral, and which I'd barely opened since then. There was the will, the title deeds, the insurance papers, everything the lawyer had handed me when we were finalizing the estate. I laid it all out in front of me and this time carefully, line by line, reread my grandmother's will. The apartment where Elma lived was indeed mine, as was the $150,000 my grandmother had left in the account. But then I came across a line that made me sit up straight. Property address, 847 Maple Street. I read it aloud, disbelieving my eyes. This was the address of the house where my mother and Gaspar had lived for the last 20 years. According to the will, my grandmother had owned the house all that time, and now it had been transferred to me. I reread this section 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. The house where my mother and stepfather had lived for so many years was officially mine. This house had belonged to my grandmother, and before her to my great-grandmother, and, as it turned out, had never belonged to my mother. Apparently, when my father died, my grandmother, out of compassion and kindness, allowed my mother to stay there with her stepfather, but legally the property remained hers. I'd had this information for a whole year, ever since I received the papers, but I deliberately kept it to myself because I didn't want to complicate our already complicated relationship. I believed everything was relatively calm between us, and I saw no point in rocking the boat. But now the boat wasn't just rocking, it was capsizing right before my eyes. It was time to find out how deep the waters really were. I dialed my lawyer, David Morrison, the one I'd worked with when I bought my apartment. I knew he had a knack for explaining the most complex things in simple terms, and that was exactly what I needed now. David, it's Bais. I need to discuss something related to the inheritance, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Sure. What happened? He replied calmly. I explained the situation to him in detail, how my mother and her husband lived in a house that was officially mine, how they'd settled there for decades but never legally owned it. Tell me, do they have any rights as tenants? I asked. Did they sign anything? Sign a contract? Pay rent? Do they have any official right to be there? No, nothing like that, David said confidently, and I heard his voice become dry and businesslike, the same one he always used to explain the most important details to me. Your grandmother allowed them to live there after your father's death, but legally, they're nothing more than guests, or, as we call them in such cases, lendals, temporary tenants without rights, and you can ask them to leave at any time. A formal eviction procedure isn't required in that case. I bit my lip and asked, what if I still want to make it official, file eviction papers? We can do that, he replied calmly. It will give you a paper trail, a legal basis, and clearly show everyone that the matter is being handled as a legal matter. How much time do you want to give them? I thought about the upcoming Saturday party, about my mother's smug voice on the phone, about how Elma allowed herself to laugh, calling my help a handout, and said firmly, 30 days. I can prepare the paperwork as early as tomorrow afternoon. David nodded. And the same goes for the apartment where your sister currently lives. Yes, I confirmed. It should apply to both properties. Bais, can I ask what all this means? This seems unexpected. I briefly summarized the situation, the Facebook post, the blackmail, the threats to my career. David whistled softly. Wow, good. We'll prepare those papers immediately. And Bais, you should document everything. Save all those posts, record the phone calls if your state allows it, because this smells like trouble. I'm already ahead of you on that, I replied, and as I hung up, I felt my lips curl into a smile for the first time in days. If they were looking for games, well, they'd soon find out they'd picked the wrong opponent. Saturday arrived, and I headed to Romano's restaurant feeling a strange calm in my chest, as if a long storm had suddenly died down, leaving behind a clear air. That morning, I'd stopped by David's and picked up the eviction papers I'd prepared. They were in my purse, neatly folded, looking impeccably official and frighteningly legal. The restaurant was aglow with balloons and a banner with a huge Elma sign. Everything was set up just as Mom had said. About 50 people, relatives I hadn't seen in years, neighbors, family friends, and Elma's college girlfriends. Everyone was laughing, drinking champagne, hugging, the atmosphere reminiscent of a carefree youth party. I spotted Elma right away. She was wearing a new dress, her face beaming with happiness, and she was chatting animatedly with her friends, as if nothing in the world was bothering her. Seeing me, she waved and smiled truly sincerely, and for a second my heart ached. I felt embarrassed at what I was about to do. As if she'd been waiting for just that moment, Mom appeared next to me. Bais, are you done? Did you bring the paperwork? Her voice was quiet, but her eyes burned into me with a cold, demanding gaze. We'll see, Mom, I replied calmly. Gaspar came over a little later, gave me an awkward hug, and muttered, Good to see you, Bais. Big day for Elma, huh? Of course, I said, and for a while I carried on as usual, talking to my relatives, eating, laughing, pretending everything was fine. But I felt my mother's eyes never leave me alone, as if she were afraid to lose control. Finally, it was time for toasts. One by one, people stood up, raised their glasses, offered words of pride and love, talked about how smart Elma had grown and how bright her future looked. Then Mom stood up and tapped her glass with her spoon, getting everyone's attention. I want to thank everyone who came to celebrate this important day for Elma, she began, her voice solemn, and I have a special announcement. She turned to me and said, almost with pleasure, Elma's older sister, Bais, has some exciting news to share about her graduation gift. Every head turned toward me, dozens of eyes fixed on my face, full of anticipation and joyful anticipation. Mom smiled, but her eyes remained cold as ice. I stood up slowly and glanced around the room. All these people believed they were about to witness a touching moment of family generosity, unaware of the truth behind the pretty picture. Thank you, Mom, I said, my voice even. Actually, I do have an announcement. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app. My experience in PR had long ago taught me to always record conversations, because people can say anything and then back out. I've been thinking a lot about Elma's graduation gift this week, I continued, and I've decided there won't be one. A collective sigh filled the room, Elma paled, and Mom's jaw dropped. You see, I said, my family tried to blackmail me into giving Elma the apartment I inherited. They posted lies on social media to frame me. They threatened my career. And so I decided that everyone here should hear the truth, how it really happened. I pressed play on my phone, and instantly the room, filled with laughter and a gentle hum of voices just a moment ago, froze in icy silence, as if time itself had slowed down so that everyone could hear the truth. My mother's voice carried throughout the restaurant, clear and unwavering, and every word seemed to cut the air. I posted this so you couldn't refuse, the speaker said, Elma's graduation is this Saturday at Romano's. You need to bring the deed to the apartment and the transfer papers, all signed and ready to go. Then I'll make sure everyone knows you're a liar. You work in public relations, Bais. How will it look when people start saying you can't be trusted, that you can't keep your promises? The recording lasted no more than 2 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. And in the deathly silence, you could have heard a pin drop. I put my phone away, pulled the envelope containing the documents from my purse, and slowly handed it to my mother. Her hands shook as she unfolded the papers, and finally a whisper escaped her white lips. "What is this?" "An eviction notice from the house where you live," I answered calmly, looking her straight in the eyes. "The house that actually belongs to me, which I inherited from my grandmother. You have 30 days to find a new place to live." I turned to Elma, and my heart ached at the sight of her tear-stained face, but I handed her a similar envelope. "Same to you, sister." 30 days to vacate the apartment. I glanced around the room, dozens of faces, drawn out in shock, eyes filled with bewilderment and pain. "Since we're all here," I continued firmly, "I should tell the truth. The house they live in is mine. It's been that way for a year. I let them stay there because I thought we were family, but as it turns out, I was wrong." Mom stared at the papers as if she couldn't believe what was happening. "This can't be legal," she muttered, clutching at straws. "Call a lawyer if you want," I replied, "but I'm sure you'll see it's perfectly legal." I leaned a little closer to Elma and quietly said, "Congratulations on your graduation, little sister." Welcome to adulthood. I turned and walked toward the exit without looking back, feeling the gazes on my back, some accusing, others stunned, others sympathetic. But I knew what I had done had to be done. Outside, the warm evening air felt like freedom, and when I got into my car, the feeling of lightness was unlike anything I'd felt in years. My phone rang before I'd even pulled out of the parking lot. Mom's name appeared on the screen. I declined. A second later, it rang again. This time, Elma. I declined again. Then Gaspar. Then Mom again. By the time I got to my apartment, my phone screen was filled with 12 missed calls, and my voicemail was full. I didn't listen to any of the messages. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the sofa by the picture window, gazing out at the shimmering lights of the evening city, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt free from the manipulations and expectations my family had imposed on me. My phone continued to vibrate and notifications poured in one after another. Finally, I couldn't stand it and scrolled through them. "Bais, please call me," my mother wrote. "We need to talk." "This is all a misunderstanding." "You can't do this to us," Elma pleaded. "Where are we going to live now?" "This is crazy," Gaspar interjected. "Your mother is having a panic attack." "Forgive me," my mother wrote again. "Okay, forgive me. Just don't do this to my family." "I'm your sister," Elma pleaded. "How can you be so cruel?" And finally, the phrase that made me laugh out loud. "We raised you better." They raised me? The mother who gave up her parental rights when I was 13? My grandmother was always my true family. She was the one who raised me. I turned off my phone and went to bed, feeling peace and quiet for the first time in a long time. The next morning, at exactly 8 o'clock, there was a persistent knock on my apartment door, more like a thrashing sound. I went to the peephole and saw all 3 of them. Mom with red, puffy eyes, Elma, a shadow of her former self, and Gaspar, embarrassed and awkward, like a schoolboy caught in a lie. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. "What do you want?" I asked dryly. Mom immediately burst into tears. "Bais, darling, I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I just wanted to help Elma start her life, but everything went wrong." "You tried to blackmail me," I reminded her. I know, and I'm sorry," she babbled. "But please, you can't kick us out of this house. We've lived there for 20 years. It was never your home," I stated firmly. "It was Grandma's house, and she only let you live there out of kindness." Gaspar stepped forward, trying to sound reasonable. "Bais, be reasonable. It's impossible to find a new place to live in 30 days. You know what rent is like these days." I looked at him coldly. "You should have thought of this before you plotted to steal my apartment." Elma, sobbing, whispered, "Where should I go? I don't have a job. I don't have money for rent." "Figure it out," I replied. "You're an adult. Remember?" Mom grabbed my hand, her fingers cold and clammy. "Please, Bais, we're family, and family forgives each other." I snatched my hand away and said firmly, "Family doesn't blackmail each other." "What if we pay you rent?" Gaspar suddenly asked, his voice unexpectedly quiet, but it conveyed the desperation of a man clinging to his last chance to cling to his familiar life. "We could sign a lease and pay you every month," he added, and I noticed he wasn't looking at me defiantly, as he had before, but as if trying to reach some common sense. I looked at him, and I admit deep down, I felt a hint of respect. At least he was trying to think practically, not deny the obvious, but find a solution. "How much?" I asked coldly, crossing my arms. Mom immediately intervened, her voice trembling with nerves, but trying to sound confident. "Whatever. We just need a place to live." I paused. The market value of this house would have been no less than $1,500 a month, but I remembered all the sleepless nights, all the tears and humiliation, all the stress they had brought into my life, and I decided there would be no more leniency. $1,200 a month for the house, I said slowly, looking Mom straight in the eyes. "And Elma can stay in the apartment for $1,000 a month." Elma's eyes widened as if I'd slapped her. $1,000, she breathed. "I don't have a job." "Then you better find one soon," I replied calmly, "or go back to Mom and Stepdad." Mom nodded desperately, as if afraid of missing out on the opportunity. Yes, we can pay $1,200, she confirmed hastily. "When will you start?" I asked dryly. "The down payment is due in a week," I said, pausing before adding, "Miss the payment and you're out immediately. There will be no second chance." Gaspar looked relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "That's fair." "We can do it," he said, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't seem aggressive. Elma, however, was still sobbing and repeating, "I can't afford $1,000. I just shrugged. "Then move out. I can easily rent this apartment to someone else for $1,500. Mom turned to her, trying to sound gentle and comforting. "You'll come home, dear. Everything will be fine." A flicker of anger crossed Elma's face, but I could see she had no choice. "I want to sign the lease tomorrow," I added, "and the first month's rent in advance." All three nodded so vigorously it was almost pathetic. After they left, I immediately called David to prepare the legally sound contracts. Then I contacted the management company and instructed them to handle Elma's apartment as soon as she vacated. The next day, Mom and Gaspar showed up with dull eyes, signed the contract, and handed me $1,200 in cash, as if it were ransom for the right to remain under my roof. Elma, scowling, packed her things and returned to her old childhood room, her look of humiliation seeming to reflect everything she had tried to inflict on me. A week later, I listed the apartment and found a sweet graduate student who happily agreed to pay $1,500 for such a cozy place. When I added it all up, I now had an extra $2,700 a month, and I was using that money to pay off the mortgage early, feeling my financial freedom growing closer with each passing day. Mom paid the rent regularly, never late, and did it exclusively electronically so we wouldn't cross paths. The management company handled the apartment, and I hadn't spoken to them or Elma since the day they came to me begging. Sometimes Elma would send me long messages, full of anger and complaints about having to live with her mom and stepdad again, but I didn't even open them. They disappeared into the trash as quickly as they appeared. A few months later, I ran into one of Mom's neighbors at the store. She smiled at me and said she thought I was incredibly generous for letting her family rent from me for such a reasonable price. I simply replied with a short, "Thank you," and the smile never left my face, even though in my heart I knew I no longer considered them family. To me, they were just tenants now, business partners who transferred money into my account every month. I made new friends at work and joined a book club, where evenings spent reading reminded me of my grandmother's lessons. I allowed myself to date again, allowed myself to be a woman living life to the fullest. My life finally became calm and free of the drama that my loved ones had imposed on me for years. Sometimes, sitting with a book in my hands and a cup of tea on the table next to me, I think about what my grandmother would say. I know she would be proud of me for standing up for myself. She always repeated, "Be strong. Don't let people take advantage of your kindness." "Kindness without boundaries is not kindness," she said. "It's just a doormat." I learned this lesson the hard way, but it's a lifelong one. My family tried to rob me, but instead, they pay me monthly rent for a roof over my head. They thought they were smart, confident in their little scheme. But they forgot the most important thing. I'm no longer that timid girl who agreed to everything for their approval. I'm a grown, successful woman now, the master of my own life, a property owner who knows how to stand up for herself. And every night, when I go to bed, I fall asleep peacefully knowing this, knowing